Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Jennifer Huang, and I'm the International Fellow at C2ES, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And we're pleased to welcome you all today for the webinar on Wheels Up, Aviation Emissions and Climate Policy. So for those of you not familiar with C2ES, let me advance the slide. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that brings diverse interests together to find practical solutions. We believe it's vital for states, cities, and businesses to work together now more than ever to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, deploy clean energy, and to prepare for the impacts of climate change. So on that note, we're glad to bring this panel of experts together to talk about aviation emissions and climate policy. International aviation is among the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Without new measures, emissions are expected to triple by 2050. Which is why we're so pleased that in 2016, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA, became the first agreement to apply a market-based climate strategy across an entire sector of the global economy. It builds on the political momentum in support of the Paris Agreement and is another major step forward in global efforts to combat climate change. CORSIA's goal is capping CO2, or carbon emissions from international aviation, at 2020 levels. With this framework in place, we're hoping that the rules will ensure that all offsets are high quality, real, measurable, that they go beyond what would have happened anyway and are not double counted. C2ES has been actively following these developments, and you can find some of our workshops and publications on CORSIA and other related resources on our website at c2es.org. So moving on to the topic at hand, today's webinar will cover an overview and state of play on ICAO's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA, U.S. implementation of CORSIA, industry perspectives on CORSIA, and thoughts on how an outcome on carbon markets at the Santiago UN Climate Conference later this year could affect CORSIA. We're fortunate enough to be joined by four leading experts. We'll begin with Nancy Young, who will provide an overview of CORSIA, and Nancy is the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for Airlines for America. We'll then turn to Dan Williams, who will talk about CORSIA's approach to sustainable alternative fuels and provide the Federal Aviation Administration approach to implementing CORSIA. Dan is an environmental protection specialist at the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. Next is Stephanie Zhu, who will speak to Delta Airlines' efforts on carbon neutrality. Stephanie is a manager of climate change strategy at Delta Airlines. And last but not least, we'll ask Kelley Kizzier to tell us about the relationship between CORSIA and the Paris Agreement. Kelley is Associate Vice President of International Climate Change at the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF. It's really great to have all of you on this webinar today. And following your presentations, we'll invite questions from our listeners. Please submit your questions using the GoToWebinar question box in the lower corner of your screen. So turning to Nancy, can you tell us a bit about CORSIA, what it is, how it works, and what there still is left to do?
Truly my pleasure if you'll advance the slides. So I am going to give an overview talking about what ICAO is and where CORSIA fits, the elements of CORSIA and how it's being implemented, and the process for what a lot of you may be concerned about, how emissions units get credited in the system. Next slide. So just to make sure that you guys know about the International Civil Aviation Organization and where CORSIA fits, ICAO is a United Nations body that sets standards for international aviation. That's how we fly from one country to another under common rules. They meet every 3 years in an assembly that sets policy, and it's really the ICAO assembly that decided to go forward with something as big as a global market-based measure. They did that in 2016, but there was a lot of work that led up into that. The body within ICAO that's charged with making sure it gets implemented correctly is a governing body called the ICAO Council, and a number of the rules are being set by them with guidance and recommendations from an expert body called the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, or CAPE. Next slide, please. So CORSIA is really a piece of an overall international aviation strategy that involves technology, operations, infrastructure, sustainable alternative fuel. But then the global market-based measure, CORSIA, is intended to help meet what the 193 countries of ICAO have agreed to, a goal of carbon neutral growth in international aviation from 2020 onward. So what you see on this slide is starting in 2021, to the extent there are growth emissions above a 2020 baseline, they will have to be offset by international aircraft operators. Next slide, please. CORSIA was set up in a framework, as I said, by the overall policymaking body of ICAO, the 193 members operating in an assembly. It's established in an ICAO assembly resolution, and these are the elements of that program. First, it is an offsetting scheme on a global basis, and hence the name Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It applies only to international aircraft operations, and that's because that's what ICAO has jurisdiction over. They have jurisdiction over flights between countries in terms of those rules, although oftentimes their rules also get picked up on a domestic basis. The application here applies to pretty much every significant aircraft operator, whether they're a business jet or a commercial airline. As you see, the exemptions are just for those with less than 10,000 tons of metric tons of carbon dioxide a year, which is not a lot. And certain aircraft of a very small size and certain types of flights, like those that you would want to make sure happen in a disaster, like a medical or humanitarian flight. The offsetting goal is to help complement those other measures, as I said, to achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020. Importantly, and I'll discuss this a bit more, that is really for those countries that are in the offsetting system at any given time. And I'll explain it in a bit. It's a phase-in system. So the carbon neutral growth goal applies to countries that are in the system for that time. Next slide. The time frame, as I said, is from 2021 to 2035. Although importantly, if you're going to do an offset scheme starting in 2021, you need to establish a baseline. So beginning on January 1, 2019, all international aircraft operators with more than 10,000 tons of emissions should have been monitoring and preparing to report to their countries their fuel burn and international greenhouse gas emissions. That will establish the baseline, so taking 2019 and 2020 emissions of those airlines and aircraft operators, that will establish a baseline from which growth will be measured beyond 2020. Once the offsetting obligation begins, aircraft operators will then have to purchase, hold on to, and then surrender or retire offsets every 3 years. So while the emissions monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements happen every year, the offsetting obligation is on a 3-year cycle. The way CORSIA is being implemented is by each country. When ICAO, as a United Nations body, sets up standards and recommended practices, they become an annex to the treaty for implementing international aviation. And so then the countries, by obligation, need to implement those agreed ICAO rules. Next slide. Importantly, as I mentioned, sustainable aviation fuels is one pathway, along with technology, operations, and infrastructure, that aircraft operators can continue to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So CORSIA provides an element of credit for those who use sustainable aviation fuel. Dan Williams will explain that a bit more. CORSIA, importantly again, for purposes of getting international agreement, is intended to be in lieu of other measures. It's a global market-based measure so that when one aircraft operator flies to another country, there's a common set of rules for addressing their greenhouse gas emissions. And although we've got the rules established and the overall framework for CORSIA established, there's a process within CORSIA to review it and potentially revise it and update it every 3 years. Next slide. The offsetting obligation was a big part of the negotiations, and how it works and how you get 193 countries to agree to it was very complicated, but it was an elegant solution. And the way it was resolved was to have countries opt in for the first 6 years of the offsetting obligation. And by doing that, we've already got 80 countries in the first 6 years. So the way the CORSIA applies, if a country volunteers in the first 6 years, all of their aircraft operators have to comply. But in 2027, the program becomes mandatory for all ICAO countries, except for those that are small island states, landlocked developing states, and least developed states. One footnote there, a number of those small island states and developing states, even though they would be exempt, are volunteering because they know that by volunteering, the large airlines that fly to their countries for tourism or cargo or other things will be pulled into the CORSIA system. As I noted, 80 countries have volunteered so far, representing about 77% of international aviation activity. Now, the offsetting obligations over the course of the years will happen under a set of agreed formulas that go from a collective approach where everybody pools the emissions growth and then spreads it across all aircraft operators to an increasing portion of individual responsibility. Next slide. This slide is just to emphasize the fact that there are two parts to CORSIA, the emissions monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is already started, and then the offsetting obligation, which begins as an opt-in for countries, but not for their aircraft operators. It's an opt-in for countries, and then it becomes mandatory for all states in 2027. Next slide. The implementation is being done under a set of rules that are established under, as I mentioned, the ICAO Council. In 2018, the ICAO Council approved a package of standards, which you can see a small outline of here, that cover the administration of the system, monitoring, reporting, and verification, offsetting, the role of sustainable fuels and emissions units. But then also, ICAO Council adopted an environmental technical manual, which gives more guidance on how those things work. Also, you can see on the ICAO website what's called implementation elements, actual lists of charts that are either populated now or will be of the states that are participating during the voluntary phase, and other information about how the program will be tracked and transparency as to who's participating and how. More information is available on the ICAO website at that link. Next slide. So this is sort of an introduction to some of what Kelley will talk about, which is the ICAO Council under the agreement is the one to establish what are the criteria for which an offset or an emissions unit, what is the criteria it has to meet to be eligible to be credited under CORSIA. Essentially, CORSIA does not create a new carbon market. What it does is create a set of common rules for tapping into carbon markets. So the criteria includes 11 different elements that an offset program or an emissions unit program would have to meet in terms of its own governance to ensure that the units that it generates and provides on the market are good. So the program itself has to meet 11 design elements, but then they need to make sure that all of the projects under their programs and the units that are generated from those projects meet 8 eligibility criteria. I'm not detailing them here, but if you're a carbon market expert or even generally familiar with it, you'll be used to terms like additionality and no leakage and sustainability and a proper governance. It's those types of elements. Next slide. So the next step really for those emissions units criteria, now that the ICAO Council has established the criteria themselves and they're published on the ICAO website, is for a special expert body created by the Council to review programs that offer those emissions units against those criteria and determine which meet the ICAO criteria so that they can list it for all of us to see. That group just got put together in its final form in March. There are 19 countries participating, and they're experts that had to meet special qualifications to participate. Those of us that are very interested in the outcome of their work are hoping that they'll get that work done, preferably at the end of 2019, but some say it may go into 2020, and we can discuss that more later. But the key thing is the TAB, the Technical Advisory Body, should be setting out a list of programs for which that generate emissions units for which aircraft operators are eligible and can use for CORSIA. And that concludes my points. So I'll turn it back to Jennifer to move us on.
Great, thanks so much, Nancy. So now I'll turn to Dan. Dan, in order to be eligible for inclusion in CORSIA, sustainable aviation fuels must deliver at least a 10% greenhouse gas reduction. Dan, can you tell us about CORSIA's efforts to make aviation fuels more sustainable and about how the FAA plans to implement CORSIA? The FAA is the body responsible for translating how CORSIA should be implemented in the US and recently developed a voluntary program for the monitoring, reporting, and verification of CO2 emissions under CORSIA. Is that right?
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, that is all accurate, as you just stated. I'm actually going to go with the how we're implementing it at FAA first, but then I will close out with some talk about fuel. So just by way of background, CORSIA has been basically my life for the past 5 years at FAA. So even before we had a CORSIA, I was working on whatever we called it before that time. And I think one of the questions I get most often is, this seems like a climate change thing, and we're the United States, what's going on here? And I'll just say that CORSIA is not part of the Paris Agreement, and it's UNFCCC we view as a very different thing than ICAO. And we have, reasons for wanting to do CORSIA that may be different than arguments that you could make pro or con for other sort of climate change agreements. In particular, we have 3 real driving reasons in the US to continue to implement CORSIA and engage at a very high level on it. Primarily, as Nancy mentioned, ICAO is a body that ensures fairness across the globe when it comes to international aviation. And because ICAO is the place where we see uniformity in international aviation, it's the place where we think any agreement to deal with international aviation's climate impact should be handled. Another driving factor is that we have seen a continual development of country-based or region-based measures that try to address the same issue that CORSIA is here to address. And even if you were to assume that, sorry about all the noise, even if you were to assume that every one of these schemes was exactly alike, you would still have all these operators having to deal with 193 different member states potentially that they fly to. And so by having a single one-stop, a single measure that assigns an operator to a state and only the one state that they deal with, it really minimizes the bureaucratic costs for operators. And for states, we know the operators that fly within our country, so we know who to be familiar with. And it makes it a lot easier for us to figure out how best to do CORSIA within our own states. And finally, in 2012, and sort of as a response to the EU ETS, Congress told FAA and DOT that we were supposed to go out and pursue a worldwide approach. And so we view CORSIA as, addressing that mandate that Congress sent to us. So the fairness, the cost, and the Congress are the reasons that we are very strong advocates for CORSIA here in the US. So next slide. So all of that's great, but what is FAA doing to make CORSIA happen? As Nancy mentioned, the standards and recommended practices, the SARPs, were approved by the ICAO Council last year. And those are the things that states will implement into their national legislation to make positive law and truly implement what it is that ICAO does. Given the time that happened, and given that there was also a 1-month government shutdown, we were in a lot of ways behind the 8 ball on even having a chance of getting done what we wanted to do. And so what FAA has done is to come up with a voluntary program. There is a beautiful picture of our website and also the link to it in the slides here. But essentially what we have done under the program is to take the requirements from the standards and recommended practices and transpose them into a program that operators can volunteer to participate in. And while they can volunteer to participate, once they're in, there's sort of not a lot of flexibility on how to do it. You do it the way the SARPs lay it out, or you don't volunteer to do it. And while that may sound like not the appropriate response on how to do it, frankly, given the amount of time that we would have had to develop the regulations, there's no chance we would have had it go through the very lengthy process to make federal regulations in the United States. And so while we have the program here as an interim measure for these baseline years, we're working really hard behind the scenes to make sure that we have regulations in place as we get past the 2020 timeframe, and we can fully implement it more the way that we would imagine other countries would also want to do it. And at the same time, we continue to work in the background, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to make sure that other states are also doing CORSIA, so to speak. And that's critical for us because CORSIA is really only a successful program if all of the ICAO member states implement it, and they implement it generally uniformly. And so it behooves us, it behooves our operators, and I think it behooves society as a whole if we see CORSIA implemented correctly around the globe. And so that, this program is maybe the first step on our way of making sure that the U.S. follows through on what it's obligated to do under its ICAO responsibilities. So next slide. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our CORSIA program, the quick and dirty overview of what it is it basically includes from the SARPs the scope of applicability, the things that Nancy spoke about. Very small operators are out of the scope. Very small airplanes also out of the scope. It does include the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification details that are copied almost word for word from the ICAO annex. What it doesn't include are the points on the offsetting and the points on the alternative fuels. Those are the things that we would imagine a rulemaking is both critical to ensure fair treatment, but also I think, I don't want to speak for the airlines, but I assume they would want that actually in a regulation before they would really sort of dive into the pool on that front. And then another key aspect of our program is that in order for it to really work, we needed a majority of our airlines to participate. And so we had set this sort of the critical mass at 90%. And I think as of, well, last week, I think was the last time I looked, we have like 97.3% or about 98%, something like that, of our operator fuel use is covered. And so, we're looking at a small sliver of operators for whom we've sort of begun a process for reaching out to see if they want to participate because perhaps they don't know of the program, or if they just intend to let us sort of fill the gap for them going forward. All right, next slide. And so again, I think that the slides are going to be available. So I just included this. So if people had questions, you have the place to reach out to our office. Basically, it's reaching out to me. But I have a separate email so I can keep all of the questions in the same place organized. But that's sort of where we handle the back and forth with our operators to ensure that the information's getting to them and getting done correctly. So that basically covers our FAA program. And then I want to go, if you could advance a slide, I want to go and talk about the fuels a bit. So the other part of my CORSIA life is dealing with the question of alternative fuels and particularly how they get included into CORSIA. In 2016 at the ICAO Assembly, this was a big deal for the United States. a lot of our operators and frankly, a lot of alternative jet fuel producers are based in the U.S. And so there was an interest both, from an environmental standpoint of getting these fuels to market, but also, from a stakeholder standpoint to ensure that there is some sort of market for these things to get to. And so we worked very hard to make sure that the Assembly resolution in 2016 included a way that one could use alternative fuels to reduce the overall offsetting requirements. And so as a lawyer, that math formula scares me. I want you all to know that at the outset. But there is some sense to it. And that sort of outlines exactly what it is that we've been doing in ICAO. The life cycle emissions line is done through a methodology that was developed within ICAO. It focuses on the sort of direct land use emission changes and also the indirect land use emission changes to come up with a number. And then the emissions reduction is a factor of that compared to a fossil fuel baseline. The other ongoing step for these fuels is to determine what, if any, additional sustainability criteria should be included. And that could be any number of environmental questions. It could be social sustainability. It could be a number of sustainability criteria that have been used elsewhere. And the question is now back to the ICAO Council on which others should be included. And then if you can just go to the last slide, this is another list of resources you can go to if Nancy, Stephanie, Kelley, and myself don't answer your questions. Hopefully you can find an answer there. And so with that, I will turn it back to Jen.
Great, Dan. Thank you so much. So to get an airline perspective now, Stephanie, Delta's been a leader in the U.S. aviation industry, launching one of the first carbon offset programs and voluntarily capping carbon emissions by purchasing carbon offsets. Why don't you tell us about how CORSIA factors into those efforts and what some of your biggest challenges are?
Sure, I can definitely do that. So first, I kind of just wanted to set the stage a little bit and maybe provide a little bit of quick background on what the industry and Delta is doing on emissions, just to show that as a company and as an industry, we're kind of doing an all-in approach to reduce our emissions. Next slide. So the first short-term industry goal is actually to reduce or improve fuel efficiency by 1.5% a year on average from 2009 to 2020. And this allows for a company to grow in terms of their business, which Delta has done. And we've seen about a 1.15% improvement, so slightly below what the industry goal is. And the one thing I would just point out here is, we implement various fuel-saving initiatives that we track on an annual basis, but the new aircraft that we're purchasing, as you can see in the last couple of years, is really the number one thing that's driving our improvement here. Next slide. And then we move on to the long-term goal, which is to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. And we're able to say we've reduced emissions by about 11% since 2005. And the other thing that I just want to point out here again is the 162 new aircraft that we're getting, I think between 2018 and 2020, and then the 168 aircraft that we have on commitment from 2021 and beyond right now is really the biggest thing that will help drive that emissions reduction. And I'll just point to also the slide that Nancy had earlier about industry emissions. There's a basket of measures that will help drive us to the 50% reduction goal by 2050. Next slide. So then we get to CORSIA. So as you can see, if you're looking at our emissions since 2005, we get this third-party verified under the climate registry protocols every year. And 2012 is kind of when our absolute emissions reduction bottomed out after our merger with Northwest. We put the correct planes in the correct places, really did a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing emissions. And as a company, we made the commitment to say we will pick the emissions from that year, and we will offset everything above that if we continue to grow as a company. So we have continued to grow as a company, and over the last several years, we've actually purchased almost 12 million offsets since 2013 in order to be able to maintain our emissions at that 2012 level. Next slide. So when we first started doing this, the first year we did this in 2013, we obviously went through a process to look at what it was that we actually needed to do to put together a portfolio, which at the time was a little bit smaller. And obviously cost was the most important thing to us to consider. And then also because there was no regulation, there's no regulation for us to buy these carbon offsets, we really started by evaluating almost everything that was available out there. So it was a very long process for the first couple of years. And then over the last few years, sort of through trial and error, we've applied our own criteria and at least asked questions to educate ourselves on things such as vintages, the project types that we wanted to invest in, what kind of social co-benefits were really important to us, and then whether the project type was more important than, for example, saying we are going to invest in a certain region of the world or it has to align with where we fly to. The first couple of years, we actually chose almost all of our projects within the Latin America region because that was an area where we were growing as a company. And over the past couple of years, we've broadened that a little bit to, as we've worked with a carbon vendor who has brought projects to us, we're a little bit more invested in projects where we can see a really good social co-benefit. And it's something that we think we will be able to invest in year after year. Next slide. So in terms of communications, when we started this as a sustainability team, we did a lot of work putting together the portfolio, educating our team here to figure out what it is that we wanted to invest in, how we wanted to tell the story. But since then, we've had to do a lot of work to kind of tell everybody else around the company about what it was that we were doing with carbon neutral growth. And we've also done a lot of work around educating our customers. So on Earth Day for the last couple of years, we've actually invited people from various carbon offset projects to come on site, either at the airport to talk with customers or at our offices to talk with employees about what is the importance of doing something like this, and that these projects that we're investing in are not just environmental projects, but have really good social co-benefits. And this year, that's one of the reasons why we partnered with Reuters to do a video that features what Delta is doing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And a large part of that feature was the conservation project in Guatemala to showcase what we're doing on carbon neutral growth and how our investment in these projects go beyond just the environmental benefits. And then as you can see here, we just try to do what we can to tell the story to all of our customers and employees. And we featured one of our projects that we invested in, TIS, in our most recent April Sky magazine. And then just moving on to how we're sort of preparing for CORSIA. So obviously, as Nancy mentioned, we are tracking our fuel and doing the monitoring, reporting, and verification starting in 2019. And we've done quite a bit of work internally as we've been building these voluntary portfolios every year to look at how we're going to meet our obligation under CORSIA. But I think the most important thing that we're waiting for is we need to understand what's going to be eligible under CORSIA as emissions units before we sort of take the next step in preparing for compliance. And that's pretty much all I have there, so I'll turn it back over to you, Jennifer.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie. So let's hear from Kelley. As many of you probably know, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change adopted most of the rulebook for the Paris Agreement last December, but were not able to reach agreement for rules for carbon markets. Kelley, you had the really tough job of former co-chair of the Article 6 negotiations. Can you tell us about how CORSIA relates to the work under the Paris Agreement and where further work is needed?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we didn't quite manage in Cato, but I'll take you through it. I'm going to take through it at a very broad level because obviously to go into the depths of both the Paris Agreement and CORSIA could take many thousands of slides. So I'll give a broad overview, and I hope anybody asks questions where there might be something missing. I also apologize because I had to wake up for a flight this morning at 3 a.m. So if I'm not making any sense, it's just the early waking. And Jennifer, I know you can bring me back on track. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start from the perspective of our views on CORSIA, because when enviros talk about something like CORSIA, we tend to focus on the quality and how to get the quality right. And I want to be clear from the outset that we're big fans of CORSIA. If successful, CORSIA can limit emissions in this fast-growing sector and can spur greater ambition in the aviation sector. Stephanie mentioned that long-term goal. If it's implemented with high integrity and transparent emissions accounting, it can catalyze a global carbon market. And EDF's very much of the view that the carbon market can align the economic incentives with the necessary low carbon transition or low carbon growth. We all know we have to get there for climate change, and CORSIA, if implemented correctly, can really be an example of how to do that, considering the number of countries involved in this sector coverage. There are some near-term decisions which will be really important. Some have already been taken, but we need the detail, and those are which countries are going to participate in CORSIA. And I think Nancy kind of went through that some. What kind of credits and fuels airlines will use. We've heard that some criteria have been agreed, that the tab has been stood up, and that they're going to start taking decision on what's eligible. There's other details we'd love to know, and some of those details will come out of the Paris Agreement as well. And then really importantly, how the emission units used in CORSIA and the alternative fuels are accounted for, and how this relates to obligations under the Paris Agreement. Because to be successful, CORSIA needs to ensure broad participation. And I think Nancy and Dan in particular went through some of the dynamics that lead to broader participation and the voluntary versus the mandatory phase. But if we don't have broad participation, CORSIA is not going to work. Second, we need to have only high quality fuels and offsets used for compliance. And that's a tricky question. And people are really looking into this. What does it mean to be high quality? And I think there's a real strategic opportunity there to look at the criteria that really mean it. And we've got the agreed criteria from the EUCs, and we've got the tab looking further into the programs to find this out. And then we've got Article 6 negotiations looking at rules for 6.4, which is a new mechanism. So all of this is kind of coming together right now. And then finally, that double counting with Paris Agreement targets is avoided. So airlines are going to be using reductions that take place in host countries. If that reduction is counted by both the airline towards their CORSIA obligation and by the country toward their Paris Agreement obligation under their nationally determined commitment, it's double counting. And we don't get an environmental benefit out of CORSIA then. So we have to make sure that the rules avoid double counting. And it's harder than you think, but I think we're most of the way there. But it would completely undermine the climate benefit of CORSIA if we were to see double counting. Next slide. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I'll give you a brief background on it. Article 6 is the sort of carbon markets article of the Paris Agreement. It allows countries to achieve their NDCs through the use of carbon market mechanisms. In Article 6, those are called cooperative approaches. This is really important because half of the nationally determined commitments submitted by parties indicate that they're going to use markets to achieve their nationally determined commitments. It was the last article to be agreed in Paris, and now it's the last one in the rule book. We like to be last, apparently. It's got 3 operative paragraphs. Paragraph 6.2 speaks about cooperative approaches using internationally transferred mitigation outcomes towards nationally determined commitments. Sorry, we really, really, really love our abbreviations and acronyms in the UNFCCC. But basically, it's about being able to account for trading for carbon markets. 6.4 is a new mechanism. Some people see it as like the CDM plus, the replacement of the CDM, a centrally certified mechanism where the UN itself has a board that approves the projects or programs. And 6.8, which is non-market approaches. Next paragraph. And then I said, what does CORSIA need from the Paris Agreement? Well, clear rules on accounting for units used by airlines which avoid double counting with Paris Agreement nationally determined commitments. That's very clear. If Article 6 or elsewhere in the Paris Agreement establishes these clear rules, then the programs used in CORSIA can follow these rules, and we can make sure there's no double counting. Also necessary are clear rules for the 6.4 mechanism if it's to be a source of supply for CORSIA, and one would think that it would be a natural source of supply for CORSIA, but we need it to be stood up and to have clear rules before that can happen. And then we need clear rules for the transition of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms, units and projects if they're to be a source of supply for CORSIA. So the Kyoto Protocol had project-based mechanisms, and some units still exist from the Kyoto Protocol, and the projects still exist. And there's a question in the negotiation as to what extent those units can be transitioned into the Paris Agreement, and those projects can be transitioned into the Paris Agreement, and under what conditions. And I think it's a real question of supply for CORSIA. Stephanie mentioned the vintage question. And when we're talking about the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol or the JI under the Kyoto Protocol, these vintage questions become really relevant. Which vintages, meaning which year the reduction took place or which year the project was registered, can be used for CORSIA. Those questions are also being discussed under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Next question. Next slide. So the good news, at COP24 in Katowice in Poland, agreement was reached on the vast majority of the Paris Agreement rulebook. This means that agreement was reached on this rulebook on time, which is almost unheard of in the UNFCCC. The bad news is that there was one outlier, and that was Article 6. Agreement on the Article 6 rules were not possible. And once again, we're the last man standing. There was significant and really significant progress made in Katowice, but agreement wasn't possible for a few outliers. One, accounting for the 6.4 mechanism. So there's disagreement amongst countries whether or not units created under the 6.4 mechanism need to be accounted by both parties, by both the selling and the buying party. There was some disagreement about accounting for reductions inside versus outside the scope of an NDC. And that means if you generate a reduction inside the scope of your NDC and you sell it, you very clearly must account for that, or else it's double counting. There has been some question about whether if you generate that reduction outside the scope of your NDC, if you have to account for it, and if that represents double counting. EDF are very strongly of the view that countries need to account for both inside and outside, but that did lead to some disagreement in Katowice. The other issue is the application of something called a share of proceeds, which is sort of a few cents for administration or towards the adaptation fund that is applied to transfers or to the issuance of units. Share of proceeds applies to 6.4, but in the treaty itself, in the Paris Agreement itself, it does not apply to 6.2. And there's some feeling that disadvantages Article 6.4 mechanism relative to 6.2, and there's some other concerns that applying it to 6.2 would be a tax on trading. So that's very much open. And then finally, there's something called an overall mitigation in global emissions, and the way that that is implemented in 6.4, we never reached agreement on. So there's just a few outlying issues. They're very important. They're very political. But if we can get those resolved, we can get there. Agreement on Article 6 rules is now a major focus for COP25 in Santiago. The good thing about that is that means we're getting the political focus that we might have lacked before when the entire rulebook, the entire Paris Agreement rulebook was still on the table. So we're going to get ministers and heads of delegation paying attention to this and pushing it over the line. And one last thing to mention is that Katowice we didn't lack agreement altogether on accounting for mechanisms. In the enhanced transparency framework, there is a paragraph 77D, that already gives us some important guidance about how to account for these things. And this guidance is agreed and already relevant for CORSIA. And it requires countries to report on, or account for really, because it includes the math, cooperative approaches involving ITMOs used towards NDCs or mitigation outcomes it authorizes for international mitigation purposes other than its NDC. And that second part really is pointing directly at CORSIA. So there's an obligation to account for mitigation outcomes that a country authorizes for CORSIA. And I think that points also very clearly to another challenge and something that we view as very important, which is host party engagement. If a country is going to be expected to account for something an airline uses for CORSIA, they have to know about it. They have to be engaged. They have to approve it or authorize it or in some way know that it exists, or else they can't be expected to account for it. And that is not the case for many, many programs. But I think that all programs are finding a way to get there. 77D has accounting using what we call an emissions-based approach, where the trades would be added and subtracted to the inventory totals. So that approach to accounting is kind of agreed now in the enhanced transparency framework. And further guidance on Article 6 will just add detail to this rule. So we are at least part of the way there in terms of how we're going to account. Next. And I think now it's just questions.
All right, that was great. That was excellent. Thanks so much, Kelley. So before, I was going to have a bit of a discussion with the panelists, but before we get there, I wanted to turn back to Nancy. And one, thank you for that great introduction to CORSIA, but I didn't give you a chance to talk about your organization. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about Airlines for America, its climate plan, and what its concerns are regarding the implementation of CORSIA.
Yeah, thanks so much. In fact, I was delighted to give the overview of CORSIA because we're big believers in it. So Airlines for America represents most of the major US airlines, and Air Canada in Canada is an associate member. And for our members, we work on the issues that they really have in common interests, and safety, security, and environment are really top of those lists. I think importantly for purposes of CORSIA and climate action, A4A has worked very closely with the other airline associations in the United States and aircraft operator associations like the business jet folks to make sure we're sort of all in the same tent in moving forward on positive climate action. And we have a strong environmental record. For example, US airlines and aircraft operators improved their fuel efficiency 125% since 1978, saving over 4.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, roughly equivalent of taking 25 million cars off the road each of those years. And we've done that through an array of technology, operations, and infrastructure measures along the lines that I talked about. But to finish this off, working with a global aviation coalition, we put together this stepwise package, and Stephanie got into pieces of it, goals that we think are appropriate for aviation given our fuel efficiency drive. So annual average fuel efficiency of 1.5% through 2020, carbon neutral growth from 2020, and CORSIA is a large enabler of that. And then a 50% net reduction in carbon dioxide in 2050 relative to 2005 levels. So technology, operations, infrastructure, and sustainable alternative fuel are key to all of the above, but CORSIA and our collective action towards appropriate policy measures, I think we believe are important both in the US and domestically.
Great, thank you. So this one I'll pose to the panel and just have us take a step back and look at this a little bit more broadly, since we've started preparatory activities for CORSIA starting last year. MRV has started for participating airlines, and reporting is going to begin in 2020. Ken, in maybe a few points, can you summarize how each of you are seeing companies preparing for these obligations, and what do you see as the major future compliance challenge or challenges?
And if I can start on behalf of the larger industry, one of the first things that aircraft operators needed to do was an emissions monitoring plan. And that essentially laid out how it is that they would make sure that they're accounting for all of the fuel burn they use in international aviation and preparing to report that to, in this case, the US government with a verification step. So we had to put together emissions monitoring plans and sign up with the US government and send those in. But now the airlines are in a process of working towards how they will get third-party verifiers on board to do that. So it's been a great deal of preparation for the first step and really a lot of keen interest for the next step in the offset market.
Yeah, so I guess if we're going in order, again, I'll be next. I think from an FAA standpoint, there's the challenge of regulation.
Dan, I think we lost you.
If I could add, while he's gone, I think we work very closely with FAA to get this voluntary agreement for the US implementation. Everybody knows, I think, on the phone that US couldn't do a rulemaking in a matter of a couple of months. And so the FAA worked really hard to get that agreement together, as did the operator community. And we are looking to a future where regs will back up that whole process.
Yeah, that's correct. You can hear me again now? Good. It seems like it's moving. Yeah, the biggest challenge for us has just been time, sort of from the get-go. And I think now that we have an interim measure in place, it's doing the regulations, but also within our own little area of the world at the FAA, it's getting the databases necessary and our systems put together so that the ability for operators to report to us what needs to be reported can happen smoothly, and we can handle it sort of without any issues from a technology standpoint going forward.
And I would echo what Nancy and Dan said. I think the one thing that I would maybe add to that we've been thinking a lot about from the operator perspective is just how everything is going to fit together come 2021 with when the offset obligation comes into place, and really what as an airline we should be doing right now to prepare for that.
Kelley, did you want to jump in?
On the monitoring question, no.
Okay. So then I kind of wanted to go back to, Dan, you were talking about how you're looking at an interim measure and that you're getting systems together. And we're talking about how the CORSIA MRV program is voluntary, but certainty is a key driver of investment and innovation. So do you have an idea when you think the FAA will conduct a rulemaking or take other action to implement the offsetting and other mandatory provisions of CORSIA?
Boy, I wish I had an answer to that question. For me personally, I wish I had an answer to that question. We are feverishly working when I am not on the phone, otherwise, figuring out how we are going to do that rulemaking and to have it done in time. It's a question of, so many other countries around the world are able to just incorporate by reference standards and recommended practices. We can't do that at the FAA, and so there's the issue of not only translating what is in the SARPs into what would be in the CFR, but there are a lot of steps internally that you have to take as an agency to ensure that a rulemaking is carried out, and so there's just a number of questions that we sort of from a procedural standpoint have to have ironed out completely before we can have any sort of I would say maybe certainty is the right word, but it's not exactly certainty. I'm sure a different language has a better word for it. but to have like a real good sense of when these things are going to come out. We just don't have that until we have the internal sort of processes and procedures ironed out on what we need to do to make it happen. I can't give you a date more specific than we're going to have it done before 2021.
Thanks. It sounds like you've got a lot on your plate. So turning then to Nancy, I wanted to ask, where do you see support from Congress and the executive branch complementing airlines' efforts in this area?
So I think very critically, we think the offsetting program, as I said, is really important to help fill what may be a gap in meeting the carbon neutral growth goal. But our efforts on sustainable aviation fuel and on things like making air traffic management as efficient as possible and thereby reducing flight time and circling and all of that, those types of things, infrastructure improvements within the United States airspace will be very critical to our continuing effort to reduce our emissions outside of the offsetting area. So I got the chance to testify before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee last month, or 2 months ago now, and we laid out some of those ideas. Things like providing more support for sustainable aviation fuels. I think most people in the US know that the tax extenders, including renewable fuel tax benefits, many of those have lapsed. And so we're supporting getting those back in place so sustainable alternative fuel can continue to make advances. And we are supporting a business case-based implementation of a modernized airspace system. And Congress, working with FAA, really has the procurement, funding, and sort of mandate opportunities to drive those. We also are principals with FAA in a number of public-private partnerships, and I'm so proud of them and actually our aviation community for things like the CLEAN program, Continuous Lower Energy Emissions and Noise program, that support sort of midterm technology breakthroughs and fuel breakthroughs for improved fuel efficiency and the other environmental parameters that we care about, like noise. So we have been concerned in this fiscal environment about cuts to programs like that, and we have been pleased that Congress has been responsive to restoring budgets that others would like to cut, and we're going to keep at that.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to ask Stephanie too. So you gave us some information on what Delta was doing, and you've been working and thinking on this offsets pathway as early as 2013. Has working on this so early provided Delta with any insights or competitive advantages others are starting to look down this pathway as well?
I mean, I think it definitely has been a learning process over the last 4 years. And like I mentioned earlier, we had to start asking ourselves a lot of questions that we never, would have thought about if we weren't, putting pen to paper, so to speak, and putting together an actual portfolio and signing a contract. So I think it has definitely been very helpful to kind of go through the actions of doing what we might need to do for CORSIA, even though we don't know what might qualify. I think it's been a really insightful process.
Great, thanks. And then a question for Kelley then. Can you say a little bit more? You were remarking on how hard it was to adopt language on Article 6. Can you say a little bit more on why that was so difficult? And do you think it'll be any easier this year? You can maybe get into some of the political dimensions that you were mentioning, and if you think we'll have a good text on how to avoid double counting between the two systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so most of the difficulty in the Paris Agreement was a difficulty with sort of scope, which means, is this about mitigation? Is this about adaptation? Or is this about finance? And finding balance in that scope was challenging. Article 6 is about mitigation, so we didn't suffer from that particular challenge that much, only to a small extent. And then there was the question of differentiation. So throughout the Paris Agreement, you have references to developed and developing countries. And when they were trying to get agreed rulebook, and for many of the articles, it was about how much flexibility, if any, would apply based on those kind of categories. Article 6 has no specific reference to developed or developing countries. So again, we didn't necessarily suffer from that dynamic either, although it comes in different ways. But at the end of the day, the breakthrough for the Paris Agreement was the idea that your commitment was nationally determined. So we have a massive array of different commitment types, you know, and different coverage and everything else. But that was how we got all of the countries of the world to sign up to the Paris Agreement, was to give that flexibility and to say your commitment is your own. But Article 6 says now you can cooperate to meet that commitment. And so there's complexity in just looking across two different NDCs, which could be of different types, of different timelines, with different kinds of targets, and figuring out how to do the math can be quite challenging. And so that was part of the reason. Just some of it is very complex. Like if you have a single year target, how do you trade with a multi-year target? If you have a target whose end date is 2025, how do you trade with someone whose end date is 2030? These are the kind of questions we faced. And so that was one of the difficulties. And then the other is, as you say, more political in nature. And we were coming out of a Kyoto system where we had established mechanisms and they were accounted for in a very specific way that reflected the realities of the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Agreement now has a new context. All countries have a nationally determined commitment, and so the accounting regime is quite different. And I think that brought its own political challenges, and that's what we're seeing. But I think it is now the focus of this year. Like I said, it's going to have a higher level, you know, a ministerial level focus, whereas in Katowice, ministers were paying attention to many other aspects of the rulebook. So that laser focus should help us get over some of those political hurdles. We resolved most of the technical issues, so we really are there. And I do think we've gotten the bones of what we need to ensure that there is no double counting with CORSIA. You can see what those bones look like in 77D. Like I said, you already see that there's a commitment or an obligation for countries to account for mitigation outcomes used for purposes other than an NDC. I think we're just going to have to get the implementation of that right, and the implementation of that has to be correct in the guidance in the Paris Agreement, and then reflected by an obligation or a commitment by the programs to follow the accounting rules that we agree. So I think we've got most of it.
Great, almost there. So we have a lot of questions coming in because we've had this great panel of speakers. So I want to make sure that we have some time to take questions from the audience. Just a reminder that you can use the question function in the question box to send us your questions. So let's have a look. We have a question from Samini Sengupta, and if someone could define carbon neutral in this case, what kind of low carbon fuel alternatives count as a credit?
So I guess I'll start with that. This is Nancy. So our target first is carbon neutral growth. So we are not at this point aiming to achieve total carbon neutrality. We're aiming to make sure that if our emissions go over 2020 levels, that we offset those. So I think that's an important distinction. And then in terms of the fuel, so we want to make sure, as Kelley and others have said, that offsets that we purchase are environmentally robust, so they actually bring the emissions reduction to account for that. Then in terms of fuels, for a fuel to meet the requirements, we have a very complicated process, but the fuel has to be made with a material that allows it on a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions basis to demonstrate an environmental benefit relative to petroleum-based fuel. And as Dan Williams went over, there is an agreed methodology now in ICAO for demonstrating that life cycle benefit. And there are, in addition to agreed sustainability criteria, there is a package of additional sustainability criteria before the ICAO Council. And we are hopeful that the ICAO Council will approve additional criteria either before 2021, when fuels begin to count towards what otherwise would be an offsetting obligation, or certainly after the very first pilot phase, which is 2021 to 2024. Dan may wish to jump in, or Stephanie, on that.
I would be happy to jump in if you hadn't covered it so well, Nancy. I don't really think there's a lot to add there. I mean, you got the baseline part right. We're sort of in a wait and see on if we are adding to what is defined as sustainability. And in the meantime, the task group within ICAO that's looking at fuels continues to examine, feedstocks and fuel pathways to determine what their life cycle benefits are. So spot on.
If I can add just one thing, this is Nancy again. A number of U.S. airlines have agreements for future supply of sustainable aviation fuel. One of our member airlines, United, has been taking supply of such fuel in small quantities, about 1 million gallons a year, but at LAX. And they have gone through the process under the roundtable on sustainable biomaterials to demonstrate the environmental benefit of that fuel. And we're very committed to processes like that.
Thank you so much. So, I mean, maybe this question is maybe more for Dan, but Dan or Nancy, Jeff McMahon wants to know more about the verification in the MRV program. So, is there any verification of the airline's self-monitored emissions? How are the emission reductions verified by third-party auditors and approved by the UNFCCC or ICAO?
So I'm happy to go first this time if you want, Nancy.
Sure.
So within the ICAO SARPs, one of the things that the technical working group had agreed on was that a third-party verification was going to be best both for operators and states. From an operator standpoint, you sort of then have a variety of options out there existing in order to conduct the verification. And for states, particularly states such as the US, where we have literally hundreds of operators, I simply don't have the time in my life to go through and do like a full-on audit of everybody's emissions report that they're going to submit. So just from a practicality standpoint, third-party verification made sense. That's what's in the SARPs. That's what governments and operators are sort of working to get to. The way that it's playing out is sort of a very similar panel of guests met with the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, a month or so ago to sort of go through, what is CORSIA, what's involved, what's going to be, required under the verification for this, so that ANC is allowed to go out and accredit verifiers. And it's largely tied to the ISO standards, but within the ICAO technical working group, there are things within the ISO standards that either didn't go far enough for really what would be needed for CORSIA, or sort of were a little bit outside the relevance of again, what would be needed. And so there's a specific set of what verifiers will be required to do to ensure that when Delta or United or American or Southwest or whomever submits their emissions report to us, the third party who has also verified their report will send their own verification statement to us as well, so that we can know that it's actually been verified someone, so that when we at FAA do our own sort of check, just to make sure, extra sure, we have some confidence that a verification has already been carried out.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think part of the question was also about the verification of the units, of the offsets. If they're UNFCCC, right?
Yeah, this is Nancy. So to add to that, so there are kind of two steps in that for the emissions units themselves. The main and most important one is that when a program gets approved under the CORSIA process and for its certain set of projects that would be eligible under CORSIA. So again, the program has to meet a certain set of criteria, and the projects and the units under that program have to meet criteria. So part of the requirements for both the program and then the units in that process is a verification process. And so the program has to have, as one of the criteria, the means to do a proper verification. And there has to be, for the unit then ultimately to be approved, it has to meet that verification process. So it's going to happen at the point of the program and the process that ICAO used to approve the program and the projects and units under them. So the point at which ICAO puts that program and the set of projects and units on their agreed list for CORSIA, there should be confidence that there's a verification system in place. And then one more step of that is when an aircraft operator then purchases units and retires them or surrenders them under CORSIA, they will have a report, an emissions units report, that will require them to identify what units they had, the serial numbers, and there can be a cross-check in that process, and will be a step to cross-check in that process to make sure that those were CORSIA eligible units.
Yeah, and for the UNFCCC side, I agree, Nancy, I agree completely that the criteria require third-party verification for the programs. The programs have to have third-party verification there. But if you're asking about the UNFCCC specifically, verification is required under Article 6.4 and under the existing CDM and under the existing JI. So verification is very much embedded in most of the programs that we see around the world. It's a standard. But I do think Nancy brings up a really important point when she comes to the emissions units reporting. I mean, the fact that the idea that this happens is great so that it can be recorded that it's eligible. And these need to be publicly reported and transparent so that we can all see what airlines are using and who's using what quality. This will be a really important way to encourage people to use only the highest quality offsets. And I think those airlines that choose to use the highest quality offsets will see benefit in it. PR benefit and otherwise, once those are transparently reported. Because travelers.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying we find more and more that travelers care that their airlines are acting responsibly. And this is just another way for airlines to show that they are.
Okay, great. I hope that helped answer his question. I have this, I'm not sure, one of you maybe can take a stab at this. Based on preliminary emissions reporting and maybe some modeling, can you tell Lisa Street what's the annual average of global emissions covered under the CORSIA program? What would that total annual global compliance scale look like in metric tons?
Well, I don't have the annual numbers in front of me, but the estimate that has been publicized from the tremendous amount of modeling work done to support CORSIA is that we're looking about 2.5 billion metric tons of carbon emission units between 2021 and 2035. There are estimates of sort of the annual amount, but I don't have those at my fingertips.
Great. And then this is, I think this maybe will go to Dan. There was a question from Janine Thornton. How many U.S. air carriers have volunteered to date? And then a question about which airlines are outside of that, the volunteered airlines that have joined.
That is a good question. So for those who are familiar with the FAA website, we actually have one of the things that we agreed within our program to do was to post the list of those operators who have chosen to participate. And so we actually have a list available. You can click on it, open it as a PDF. In terms of actual numbers, I don't think I've actually counted. It's a lot. It's more than 97% of the total for the international fuel use by U.S. operators, so therefore emissions. And I think the ones that we have left, that's a difficult question to answer because it's tied to the sort of scope of applicability of 10,000 tons. And so we have, of the remaining 2-point-something% that haven't actually volunteered, you're talking sort of really small charter operators, sort of businesses that have private jets that they fly around. And some of them we assume probably aren't aware that the program exists. As Nancy mentioned, in addition to working pretty closely with A4A to make the program work, we've also worked with the Cargo Airline Association. We've worked with the regional operators, and we've also worked as closely as we can with the business jet operators. They have their own association. And so, as you get to the groups, there are a lot fewer sort of really large airlines than there are businesses that operate jets. And so we just you don't get everybody to be aware of and get a hold of things. And so we continue to work with all of those associations, but in particular the business one, to see if we can get more of them to participate. But at the end of the day, the burden is on the United States to sort of estimate for our operators generally what the baseline is going to be for 2019 and 2020. And that is part of in the program statement, this is the opportunity to volunteer. The United States is going to have to comply, so we would estimate their emissions for them if they choose not to volunteer.
Yeah, this is Nancy. If I can just add, all major U.S. airlines are in there. I'm just, really, really proud of that. Both the U.S. Cargo and passenger carriers that we represent and the regional affiliates for them. So many of the business jet operators. So when you look at the list on FAA's website, you'll see you recognize ones like United and FedEx and UPS and Hawaiian and JetBlue. But you'll see a lot of names you don't recognize because they may be business jet operators or other types of operators that you might not have as much familiarity with. So I think we have a really good story to tell there, and Dan's absolutely right. When ICAO adopted the standards and recommended practices, they put in a provision for every country that to the extent you have operators that you do not get the data for, you are required, country, to fill in the gap with agreed modeling tools, and those extra emissions will be assigned to those missing aircraft operators. So I think the US probably has one of the highest compliance rates in the world, just because we're all very serious about this, but there is a means to cover up that additional bit of emissions, or I shouldn't say covered up, I should say account for that additional bit of emissions.
Thank you. So one of our listeners is worried then, is there a withdrawal provision from CORSIA? Is there any danger that the Trump administration can withdraw the US from CORSIA?
I'm suspecting that Dan can't answer that question, so I will answer it. The US airlines and aircraft operators and our larger aviation industry have been very committed to CORSIA as part of our package of climate initiatives. And so our position with the administration has been, and we're very pleased that they have authorized going forward with this program. Our position has been, this is an important thing for doing business internationally and for addressing our own climate commitment. So I think we've been very pleased that they have focused on it, and our continuing goal will to keep the US going forward. I think from my perspective, and we've made this point internationally, the potential risk is if other countries do not heed the provisions in the agreement that this is to be the single market-based measure applying to international aviation. If we end up in a patchwork quilt that we were trying to avoid, that those are the types of things that could convince governments like ours that it may not be the best program. So we want to make sure that countries comply, and we're working very closely with airlines and aircraft operators around the world to make it successful.
Yeah, so Nancy's right. I can't totally chime in on that, but I will say that ICAO standards and recommended practices are agreed on by member states. They become part of the Convention on International Aviation, the Chicago Convention. So it would be a very difficult thing for any government to sort of withdraw itself from such a thing, and it could be problematic from a precedential standpoint within ICAO if one were to do that.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine a few questions, and there's some questions about the renewable and the biojet fuel. Somebody said that there are challenges in producing that kind of fuel. They want to know whether the U.S. has identified any kind of viable clean energy fuels and what your estimates are on the total market demand for this fuel in order to meet CORSIA goals.
So I don't know if Dan's going to answer that. So we know how to make the fuels. We have developed all the safety protocols to make sure the fuels meet the jet fuel specification. We've developed the environmental analysis provisions on a consensus basis to demonstrate that they're good. The challenge is commercial viability. The fuels are still very expensive relative to petroleum-based fuels, and a lot of the incentive programs available for ground-based fuels have not been available for sustainable aviation fuels. And so the ramp up has been fairly slow, but steady. And so I guess the way I would answer this from an airline perspective, we would really like to drive the sustainable aviation fuels market to scale up so that more of what would be an obligation for offsetting could be met by the fuel than less. But it's going to take several years to do that. As I said, right now, there's only one US airline that's able to take commercial supply in the United States, and that's United Airlines, simply because it's in a way, a startup industry. There are so many incentives to provide ground-based alternative fuel and not jet fuel. But the states of California and Oregon recently recognized alternative jet fuel as an opt-in, not a mandate, an opt-in under their programs, their clean fuel programs, and we're urging more programs like that to help us scale up supply. So I can't give you a real number on that, but we're very dedicated to making it happen.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, you know, there's been a market for the most comparative ground-based fuel is diesel, and so there's been a market for renewable diesel fuel for a number of years. It's been included in the RFS since the RFS, you know, was created in 2007. There has not been the same market and the same time frame for alternative jet fuel. It's just not, you know, it's a far more captive market for jet fuel anyway, but there hasn't been the same sort of demand that there has been. And so what you see is a challenge of what is now almost an established industry and one that has a lot of demand for, which is the road diesel. The road diesel, you now have jet fuel sort of trying to get into that same space, and that adds to the challenge that's already there of just trying to bring a new fuel into the system.
Great, and I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question before we end the webinar. And we have a question from Matt Lithgow. What is the ICAO Council expected to discuss at its meeting this week as it relates to CORSIA? And he'd like to know what are the panelists hoping to see as the main outcomes for the Technical Advisory Board, the terms of reference, emissions units, anything else on the agenda?
I guess I can field that one first, since I probably have more insight to the ICAO Council than the other people. So the way that the council works is they have a number of sessions throughout the year. This is the start of their May and June session. I don't even think that I've actually seen the order of business for what they will be discussing going on up there. But the ICAO Council has a number of important things that they deal with far beyond just environmental things. And this also happens to be the year of the assembly, which happens every 3 years. So there's a lot of preparation in getting documents, the resolutions sort of through council in order that it can make their way to assembly. So I can't tell you exactly what council is going to talk about in terms of environmental things this week. I would only be hazarding a guess that it's probably the resolutions that they will update for the assembly in late September.
Yeah, this is Nancy, if I can add. I mean, the ICAO Council in its session will be dealing with some of the additional points on CORSIA. For example, they'll receive the updated report on sustainable aviation fuel sustainability criteria. But I think more critically for this council session, they are going to be asked to approve the array of recommendations made by the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection on whether it's noise, or a lot of people don't know that the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection just recommended a new stringency for the non-volatile particulate matter standard for future aircraft, and a whole work program for the next 3 years. So there are CORSIA elements that they will continue to advance, but they've already approved the tab and its terms of reference. And so I think the technical advisory body needs to just do its work, and the ICAO Council needs to approve the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection recommendations on all of the environmental standards, not just CORSIA, for the next step.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I know, just from our perspective, like we say, we'd like the tab to get on with their work, applying their agreed criteria and applying their agreed guidance. We'd like to see them make public the guidance and the terms of reference under which they operate, and to make public their recommendations, because there's always a kind of a little bit less transparency when it comes to ICAO than we would be used to in some other UN processes. But to apply those agreed criteria using the agreed guidelines and to make public the result of that would be great.
I'm happy to open the floor to any last remarks by the panelists. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Stephanie, to that question, or just any remarks in general.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. Thank you, Nancy, Dan, Stephanie, Kelley, and everyone who's tuned in this afternoon. In case you want to review this webinar or send this webinar along to colleagues, we are recording this session, and we will post the webinar to our YouTube channel tomorrow. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.